Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have David Bather Woods. He's Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Warwick. He's co editor with Timothy Stoll of the Schopenhauerian Mind. He has contributed chapters to the Proustian Mind, Schopenhauer's Moral Philosophy, and the Palgrave Schopenhauer Handbook. And his new book, available November 18th, is called Arthur Schopenhauer, The Life and Thought of Philosophy's Greatest Pessimist. David, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And so just to kind of get this on record. So I haven't completed the book, but I have started reading it and I really love it so far. So, and interestingly enough, so my favorite passage is actually from the preface and you're going to see why, but I'm like, wow, I can't believe you got it like right off the bat. Okay. So in the preface, David wrote, after many years of studying Schopenhauer's philosophy and regularly being asked, but don't you find it all too depressing? At a certain point, I realized what it is that stops me from throwing out all of his books in despair. Schopenhauer's picture of life is bleak because he severely doubts that we will ever come close to the happiness that we so crave. But it would be far bleaker, intolerably bleak, if in the midst of it all we couldn't still love one another. Fortunately for us, Schopenhauer doesn't doubt love. Admittedly, he only really believes in one basic form of love. "Quote unquote, all genuine love is compassion," he once wrote in his notebook. But Schopenhauer went on to say many more profound things about this. The only form of love, including that it is the essential quality of human nature. Human beings, that is, are not only accidentally capable of compassion, rather being compassionate and part of what it means to be human. So for me, that's just like, that's so amazing. So the fact is that, like, when we think about philosophy, we think about sort of the complexity involved, and I'm pretty sure we can't really boil it down to just love. But it's just so interesting to me that it sort of seems like what he's saying, which is a little bit more obvious, I guess, is that he's fundamentally saying that, like, despite the fact that, maybe sort of there isn't any, or there aren't any solutions in religion or in, kind of metaphysics in the way that, most people think about it. The idea is there's still something to be had in terms of a life meaning just based on love alone. So can we actually just kind of dive into that? And why was it so important to him? And how did he even discover that?
Oh, good. All really brilliant questions. And I'm glad you liked that part. I enjoyed writing that. When I had the idea for that part of the preface, I was quite pleased with myself because I did want to lighten things up a little bit because his reputation precedes him. He's known as this dark pessimist, quite a grumpy character. But that is the light I find in his work, which is that his whole ethical philosophy is based on compassion. So it's not based on sort of abstract utility. It's not based on abstract duty. It's not even, well, some people argue whether he's some sort of virtue theorist. I think that's a stretch. I think he's something else altogether, which is, that it is, squarely based on compassion, where compassion is his definition of moral love. And I thought that was important to put in there because on the one hand, it lightens his philosophy up, and also it's for today's world, a world that's also equally dark. A message of compassion is, I think, a good one.
Mm-hmm.
And where it came to him, and there's a few different potential intellectual sources here. And in terms of when he actually presented that idea, there's a nice anecdote here, which is that it was for an essay competition. He wrote this. He wrote two essays in the late 1830s for competitions. One of which he won, which was an essay on free will for the Norwegian Royal Society of Sciences, and one of which he lost, which was an essay on the basis of morality for the Danish Royal Society of Sciences. And he lost this competition, even though nobody else entered. He was the only person who entered it. He spent so much of it kind of bad-mouthing all these other philosophers that they just couldn't award him the prize. But his basic thesis in that book was that compassion is the basis of morality. When we're trying to pick out the characteristic that we esteem in a moral sense, that we praise above all, there is an element of kind of radical selflessness to all morality. And it's the selflessness of being incentivized to by the pain of others and to alleviate their pain. And that was, his compassion was his word for that. So that's where he presents the idea. In terms of intellectual sources for it, there were philosophers who thought things like this. More recently to him, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who Schopenhauer thought was the best moral philosopher, and also Adam Smith, although Schopenhauer disagreed with Smith. Smith had a theory of moral sentiments that was based on sympathy. But much further back still is the influence of Buddhism on his work. Well, he's one of these philosophers who kind of likes to present himself as totally original.
Mm.
And it's like it's just a coincidence that a lot of his ideas overlap with Buddhism.
Sure.
But it's one of the things that put this Danish society judges off. One of them was actually the Bishop of Zealand. He was himself a cleric. He wasn't going to have this Schopenhauer's atheistic Buddhist stance. But in any case, Schopenhauer really derived an ethical message from classical Indian philosophy like Buddhism and also Hinduism, namely that if we are all ultimately manifestations of this one life force, for want of a better word, then those who treat others not as distinct from them, but actually as the same as them, are metaphysically to that degree more enlightened. They're actually a nice phrase, and I use this in the title of the chapter where I tell the story in the book, is that he says to live nobly, to live well, is to translate my metaphysics into action. That's what, So those who are treating each other well are actually understanding the world more correctly. So that's kind of where that idea comes from, ultimately, is in his philosophy.
Yeah, and I feel like the big giveaway is that he named his dogs Atman, right?
Yes.
Yeah, as far as that goes, like, okay, the metaphysical self. All right.
That's
Yeah.
right. And he repeatedly used that name, almost like he was trying to, it was like a metempsychosis, like a transmigration of souls that he thought kind of one soul, the dog soul, went into another by having a string of dogs named Atma. Yeah.
Mm.
Now, one thing that I find, okay, so I can see where the compassion is in his philosophy, right? I could see it. However, I can't help but have another side to me that feels like I can't reconcile the way he lived his life
Mm.
Hmm.
in terms of his relationship to other people
That's right.
with that. Like even granted understanding that, okay, he says essentially we're oh, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but that we're like a slave to the will, and individuality is an illusion, and we're kind of like, for example, notions of romance or procreation are just us kind of doing what is the, quote unquote will of the species, but it's ultimately something he doesn't want to participate in because it doesn't feel like it's genuinely, what he is, as a being, as a,
Mhm.
yeah. Forgive my framing. It's just
No,
that
no,
I have trouble, parsing it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, so that is correct that he thinks our everyday psychology is dominated by self-interest and egoism, and 99% of our actions um, are motivated by our own, our own personal interests or the interests of the people we feel partial to, our family, our close friends, or whatever.
Mm.
Meaning that this type of compassion is an achievement and a rare one. He actually says some things that sound conflicting. Actually, is that he in some places he sort of talks about compassion as if it's this extremely rare thing, and then in one or two places in his text he sort of says we see and do it every day. The small things that we do for somebody where there's absolutely no self-interested incentive. Um, which makes me think, well, you can square that circle by saying, well, if you take a day and you were to, divide it up into 1,000 actions, maybe one of those actions would be compassionate. And then you think, okay, well, then it is rare. It's just that, God knows how many actions you perform in a day. So it can be rare and still daily.
Mm.
Now, was Schopenhauer a daily practitioner of compassion? I doubt it. Like, there aren't that many stories. One of the challenges of writing the book is that he's not necessarily a likable character. But I wanted to have fun with that because, well, um, I didn't want to write a hagiography, a kind of a biography of a saint. I wanted it to be almost an anti-hagiography in that I wanted it to, I sometimes find it annoying when um, biographers kind of fall in love with their subject matter and it feels like they
Mm.
can do no wrong or whatever. Like I do love Schopenhauer, but I love all his I love him despite and in spite, and through all his flaws and everything. And so yeah, so I didn't want to hide away from the fact that he's quite an unlikable character. At the same time, he has some redeeming qualities.
Mhm.
I think actually his philosophy is a redeeming quality, not just because it's, obviously exceptionally a brilliant artifice, but also because there is actually real heart to it. Like he may not have had a lot of heart in his personal relationships, so far as we can see, but in his philosophy, it's just full of sympathy with the human condition.
Mm.
I think that's where he put a lot of his compassion. Now, that's quite abstract, of course, one would say that really compassionate people would be out there actually helping people. But still, there's that. And then the other way to look at it actually is that could kind of flip it and say, well, even though Schopenhauer has all these, off-putting, serious character flaws,
Mhm.
well, that doesn't exclude him from love either. Just
Mm.
as if the message here is that everybody, we should be, when we see suffering, we should be motivated to want that person to be raised from it or to help them to get out of it. Obviously, we can't do that with Schopenhauer now, but we can see his pain, the pain he experienced in his life, and we can feel for him and feel like we want him to find release and to find um, to find a way out of his suffering. So that was part of it. The part of the thing as well is that well, it's another thing about compassion. For Schopenhauer, compassion's certainly not based on merit, in the sense of achievements. You don't you deserve compassion because you're talented or you're likable. You deserve compassion for other reasons, that you're a being that suffers.
Mhm.
Mm.
So I would want to kind of respond to the comment of, the real, and I'm sure you didn't mean it. You were just kind of saying it as an argument, right? So there's this argument that, if he were really compassionate, sort of he would be out on the streets, whatever, protesting,
Mhm.
participating in some sort of food bank, whatever, right? So
Mhm.
interestingly enough, let's say if somebody were to make that argument, the reason why I would disagree with that is because of this, right? So, before we started filming this, we talked about psychotherapy and sort of the kind of the sort of the take on it that he might have in terms of like a remedy for people, but let's say in terms of helping people, right? So interestingly enough, I'm kind of really against sort of modern kind of, I guess you could call it pop psychology, but it also is a little bit more a little bit more academic in some sense, even though not really. But the point is to say that often when we think of psychology and when we think of let's say kind of the articles that we would read or just like podcasts that we would listen to, especially, it's usually stuff like, how do I make myself happy, right? So it's like the ways to love myself, right? The ways to make yourself happy. Self-care. Oh my God, self-care is another thing.
Yeah.
So when you hear somebody or read something like something from a Schopenhauer and he says, well, actually the thing that'll it's more indirect, right? It's like this thing that sort of makes you feel like life is meaningful is compassion, right? You actually often don't get that in pop psychology, nor do you often get that from podcasts. So if you go on like no offense, if you go on like Psychology Today, let's say, and because I write for them, so whatever, I
Yeah.
can, I can kind of talk shit. So if you go on Psychology Today and you look at like the most popular articles, it's literally like ways to love yourself and ways to feel good
Yeah.
about yourself, things that you could do for yourself or whatever, right? I'm
Mm.
not saying that there isn't room for that, which there is, but I think a lot of times, and unfortunately this happens oftentimes with therapy, is people kind of miss the mark. And I would argue even psychiatrists, psychologists, whatever, they miss the mark too, because there's this sense of which becomes a preoccupation with, but there's a sense of self-love, right? How do we get the person to love to love themselves? So what
Mm.
I'm seeing from Schopenhauer is there's a kind of a focus away from self, right? Whether it's sort of his preoccupation with animals. I mean, I know he had obviously difficult relationship with women, obviously misogynistic, unquestionable. But the point is to say, I mean, especially in the context of what was around at that time, and especially in the context of what's around today. Again, you have this preoccupation with self, right? Sort of how do I progress? How do I succeed? How do I become better? How do I this, that, whatever, right? And he's essentially saying like to get your mind away from that, to become compassionate, to sort of to care about other things, other beings, the world around you,
Mm.
essentially. Like that's sort of the things that gives a person meaning, and you could even call it joy. But it seems like joy here, if that would exist, right, is a byproduct of that. It's not this sort of direct chase or pursuit, which again you often get in modern times.
And I just wanted to tag that a little bit. The thing that I appreciate about Schopenhauer, his work essentially, the reason, of course, it's criticized as dark sometimes, right? Is it really actually makes you engage with kind of the darker aspects of human nature, your own nature. This a lot of new things. I mean, the best. I mean, I don't want to overgeneralize. I'm sure there's an author out there actually making waves, breaking paradigms, but usually what you get is just more like, okay, let's meditate or
Yeah.
focus on the here and now, which is, by the way, beautiful
Hmm.
and excellent and also a very powerful way to, I'm not disagreeing, but it is definitely unique to engage kind of like right in your face the darker aspects
Right.
of your own
Hmm.
self. Yeah.
Wait, can I actually let me add a question to that? So, David, so then would you say because Schopenhauer was actually able to face that darkness in, kind of whatever way you want to conceptualize it, was that one of the reasons why he found compassion to be a necessity?
Yeah, good. No, I think just to start at the end there, yes, that in a way his pessimism has to form the backdrop of his ethics of compassion. In a way, it optimism can sometimes be an obstacle. This is an argument that pessimists or anti-optimists often make.
Mhm.
Optimism can often become an obstacle to sincere compassion for others. Um, because in a way, if you're somehow undermining or disbelieving the seriousness of their suffering, because maybe you think it's actually for the best, maybe you think it's actually necessary, from a kind of God's eye perspective. Maybe you think it will resolve itself, or what have you, or it's not as serious as it seems. Then that not only undermines their suffering, but undermines your ability to be compassionate with them. So I think his pessimism does, and that's what impresses some people, as well as some other, attitudes. So there's a book by Mara Vanderloot that's come out recently called Hopeful Pessimism.
Mhm.
And she has a book called Dark Matters where she makes arguments like these, for the necessity of some of these tenets of pessimism to be genuinely compassionate with others. And the other thing, I think you're right that for Schopenhauer, compassion takes us out of ourselves, um, and even in a way that's almost a kind of spiritual practice. So again, to one of his remarks about the connection to Buddhism here and to other philosophies, that in terms of the higher spiritual ideal would be one of an even deeper or transcendent form of selflessness in the forms of kind of asceticism, kind of self-denial. He talks about like these kind of self-mortification and the kind of hair shirt and all this stuff. And he says these things don't have to be taken so literally, like actual self-flagellation. Of course, those things do happen in ascetic practices, but also moral values can be a form of ascetic. It's a form of mortification of the self and the will to to take somebody else's suffering as your own. There's a point at which he thinks actually if you take on enough suffering, then you kind of end up sort of permanently rupturing the ego, and you
Mm.
go down a completely different spiritual path that's maybe only open to a very few, of the kind where you become saint-like or Christ-like, Buddha-like, or take your pick. So yeah, I think that's right he's focusing on others in his moral philosophy. Again, you always have to kind of compare the life with the thought here. I think as a person,
Mhm.
I think he was quite self-concerned a lot. And this is why it's interesting. It is an interesting question to go back to that. Is like how well did he practice? Not that that's a way to evaluate his philosophy or even him, but it's an interesting question whether he lived out his values or not.
Can I ask you? I'm sorry. Can I just really quickly on that? I just want to ask. This is just a pure opinion. Like, so you don't have to. This
Okay.
doesn't even have to be just factually based. So I am curious. Do you feel like, in some ways, by him writing that and sort of thinking those things, right, it was a way for him to try to overcome himself?
Oh, I mean, I don't think he thought of that self-consciously as his mission.
Hmm.
I think he thought of it in more objective terms, because even that is quite a self-concerned thought, isn't it? Like, I need to overcome myself.
Right.
I think he always spoke in terms of truth. And of course, paying attention to the truth is a way of turning away from yourself,
Hmm.
but not by being motivated, not by being repelled by the self, but just being drawn to truth. So I think he did end up doing that. Of course, anyone, a philosopher, a writer, anyone who's doing that sort of thing well is going to, um, to achieve that. But I think, yeah, he was brought out of himself by more objective concerns. Like he really just wanted to capture. This is, one of the great things about why he's so attractive to a lot of people. It's such an ambitious philosophy. It's just he tries to capture everything, as much as he can, um, and explain it in a kind of unified way.
Mm.
That's a very old, become a very old-fashioned way of doing philosophy now, where things are way more broken down and specialized and things like that. But yeah, ultimately, it was truth that he was after, I think. Although as a byproduct of that, yes, he would have ended up being, putting his ego aside.
I have sort of a speculative question, sort of related to your
Mm.
question,
Hmm.
and then also related to what you said about, maybe causing enough suffering so that the ego kind of goes away or dissipates, kind of like
Mm.
one of those the path of excess leads to the palace of wisdom sort of things. Now, I would this is again, this is purely speculative because this is I haven't seen proof of this, at least in my knowledge of Schopenhauer. But do you think that after a certain point, after also realizing that, our sense of individualism is an illusion, and, again, back to what we spoke about before, kind of slaves to the will and that sort of thing, wouldn't he also have, and again, speculation, come to the realization that his own distancing from
Yeah.
others
Mm.
was also kind of based off of some kind of a
I know.
premise that is
Yeah.
also illusory. So then, based on that, do you think that he purposefully, in his pursuit of, in the intellectual realm, because that is something he was incredibly fascinated by, he wanted to devote his entire life to the intellectual pursuit, as
Mm.
far as that goes. So, do you think that he purposefully allowed himself to suffer in excess, even knowing perhaps that there were, maybe ways out of it
Mm.
Mm.
in order to come up with more like interesting things in the intellectual world, in order to really
Mm.
break past where anyone has gone at that time and become
Yeah.
as influential
Yeah, like
as he
to
did.
become like a mystic of sorts, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Mm.
so yeah, there's a couple of things in that. One is that there is the question of like, why did Schopenhauer live the way he did, given that if you were to follow the letter of his philosophy, he knew better. He knew of better ways to live. Um, One way you can answer that in his own terms is that he was actually very skeptical of the whole category of practical philosophy, by which he meant, that's a word that sometimes just means moral philosophy, but he means something specific, something different, which is um, um, philosophy as a practice whereby when you study moral philosophy and you learn about the good, you somehow become good,
Mm.
that it shapes you, and you can actually be motivated to be better just because you know better. He thinks that doesn't follow in the same way that the analogy he uses is artists. Just because you study beauty doesn't mean you're beautiful. You may be able to create beauty, express it, articulate it, capture it, what have you, in the way that a philosopher might be able to do the same with certain truths, but it doesn't mean that you become the thing that you study. So that's one reason why, and so that the question then is, well, how do you become the thing? And I think, again, it goes back to truth, but in a different form. Like he seems to think that when people have a moral turn, it's through some insight, which brings us to the second part of your question. Like that insight is often found in suffering. Like
Mhm.
when somebody, like the examples he gives of sort of religious and mystical conversions. Well, one pathway anyway he draws is when somebody has a kind of profound experience of suffering, like they discover their dead loved one or something horrendous, horrendous shock, which makes them kind of resign from life. Whether Schopenhauer cultivated that, I'm not sure. Like he
Mhm.
actually, he gave himself lots of little treats, like he was, in the middle part of his life, like actually when he was having it in the 20s, in the 1820s up to the 1831 to cholera pandemic that ravaged eventually Berlin, and was, in some accounts part of the demise of Hegel, but Schopenhauer escaped. Up until that point, he was having a miserable time in Berlin. He took on a few very long holidays in Italy and really enjoyed himself, it seems. And his daily routine was founded on the small comforts. I mean, I suppose one slightly ascetic thing he did was have cold baths every morning, and he liked to swim in the river, even into his older years. And but other than that, he would read. He would do some serious study in the morning, some serious writing. He might have a little nap. Often, like the anecdotes of people coming to his house to try and catch him when he became famous in his later life. He's in the middle of having a nap and he kind of wakes up grumpy. It's like, who's this? But he'll read it, and then he'll have a little bit of lunch. He'll walk his dog. He'll play his flute. He'll have a cigar. He'll go to the opera. He'll have his dinner. He'll have some nice table conversation. He'll come home and, he was an early riser, and then he'll just get up and have his bath, his cold bath to kind of invigorate himself again. He wasn't exposing himself to that much pain. And I think actually the isolation was similarly a protective thing. He genuinely did, if he really wanted to, expose himself to suffering, he should have had more friends, or surrounded himself with people that would have driven him mad. I think there is a kind of bit of an inconsistency with his life. Again, that's no basis on which to evaluate his life or thought, but it's an interesting thing I think he lived well in that sense. He found a life that fitted him, and that's some things I'm trying to get out in the book, is that I actually do think ultimately, for a philosopher who thought that it's impossible to live well, pretty much, he lived very well. He was true to himself. And I think that's important,
Yeah, and it's interesting that there's an association with Buddhism, because if you think about it, his life is antithetical to Buddha. So
pretty much.
Right. So just for our audience, with Siddhartha Gautama, I mean, the idea was that he was this isolated prince, and then essentially he goes off into the world one day, he sees suffering, and he's like, oh my God, I can't live like this anymore. I need to find out what the meaning of life is. And then he starts meditating, and he's like, oh my God, the sort of pleasures and the sort of the kind of, I guess, benefits of being isolated and protected, obviously, kind of are sort of like outweighed by what I'm missing, right? Essentially, they're outweighed by just fully being kind of encapsulated in life, whereas Schopenhauer obviously takes the sort of the alternative route there. And then interestingly, obviously Schopenhauer's, I don't know if they're his main critics, but definitely some major critics, they would have criticized his lifestyle as kind of being bourgeois, especially at that time, right?
Yeah.
Socialism prevailing. So can we actually talk about some of that, right? Some of the actual sort of literary, not just literary to be fair, but more so lifestyle criticisms of Schopenhauer, especially honestly by people who are more or less revolutionary.
Yeah. I mean, there's a chapter in Georgi Lukash's book, The Destruction of Reason, from the 1960s, which some people, even Lukács scholars, think is not his best phase of work. But there is a chapter on Schopenhauer where he really, lays into Schopenhauer and about he says that Schopenhauer was the first ideological leader of the bourgeois class after the 1848 revolutions, failed revolutions. And there is a story, an anecdote that's probably, certainly boosted by Lukács, where, Frankfurt, where Schopenhauer lived, was a hub of revolutionary activity. And the one time when fighting really kind of broke out on the streets and people lost their lives on all the different political fronts that were fighting. Schopenhauer's one intervention was to allow a group of Austrian soldiers basically to take pot shots at the people on barricades. So he was very firmly on the side of order in that sense. So people like Lukács, who by that point is a hard-bitten, Marxist thinker, were definitely, that was kind of grist to Lukács's mill. And there are others too who kind of present him this way. It's true. I mean, and I think, well, actually, Lukács kind of extends that by saying that he criticizes the Frankfurt School, the later group of Marxist thinkers from the 20th century, who were, very much influenced by Schopenhauer. Some of them very much like Max Horkheimer in particular,
Mhm.
they were similar. They were cut from the same cloth. I mean, in the sense that they were all bourgeois boys who didn't want to go on the barricades,
Hmm.
but had, in the case of the Frankfurt School, kind of liberationist beliefs, and so took refuge in, or kind of had philosophies that would enable them to continue their bourgeois pursuits, sort of in the
Mm.
name of liberation, that the art was going to save us, and this is the thing that Lukács found kind of a bit hard to take. But I mean, that's a bit of a reductive, you know, presentation of the Frankfurt School. But Schopenhauer was I can see what Lukács was saying in that Schopenhauer was a model for that sort of person who was from their background. Their fathers were kind of factory owners and businessmen and things like
Mhm.
that, and they wanted to they didn't want to live those lives. They didn't want to become that sort of bourgeois. So they kind of invented a different kind of bourgeois, which was the kind that found a way to live a life of the mind while also making a contribution to liberating the world from the very systems that their fathers and forefathers had helped to sustain. So
Mhm.
Schopenhauer, even though he's very much not a philosopher of the left, ended up in that respect actually oddly being embraced by at least that part of the left. Um, yeah, and there were others too. Again, it's another point. It's another kind of coming up against this tension about Schopenhauer's how much the life matters to evaluating the thought or not. I think these are interesting stories, and they do say a lot about Schopenhauer, and they're in the book as well.
Mhm.
Um, but I think in a way, it's a kind of typical um, move that actually I think Lukács is kind of very responsible for, which is to. I mean, he says some interesting things about Schopenhauer's philosophy, but some of it's really inaccurate.
Mhm.
And and he's doing more to sort of say how Schopenhauer is an expression of his class than actually engage with the thought itself, which is part of, I think that is deliberate. But if you disagree with that method of assessing philosophy, then you're not going to take that criticism that seriously.
Mhm.
Mm. And it also made me think of Thomas Jefferson because so with Jefferson, he was also a little bit like Schopenhauer, probably a lot like Schopenhauer, to be honest. So he was a brilliant man. He was considered to be fairly effeminate and very sensitive. And so Jefferson at the time, he got a lot of shit for not really fighting. So Jefferson wasn't a fighter in the Revolutionary War. There's actually this famous scene where he essentially when he hears that the redcoats are coming, so he essentially bolts, right? So he takes all of his things, and when they're I don't know, maybe like a day out, not even probably a day out, maybe half a day out, he's out. Like he abandons his mansion, he abandons all of his slaves in the mansion. He's like, I'm out of here. I gotta save myself, right? But the thing with Jefferson, what I think made him so appealing to people was the fact that in his own way, he fought for the revolution and he fought for revolutionary ideals. So I'm thinking, and I don't know enough to say, which is why I'm going to ask you this question. So do you feel like Schopenhauer would have done himself a better service, or would have been sort of more, I guess, popular? I don't know if that was his goal even, but would he have been more well liked, let's say, had he sort of taken on and maybe appealed to Marxist thought more than he did at the time?
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. Like he does his life does overlap with Marx, and there's a reference. He doesn't ever name Marx, by the way. He names Feuerbach in connection with Hegel, and he says something like, "Oh, Feuerbach a Hegelian. That's all you need to know." He probably would have said the same about Marx. There is this reference in Schopenhauer's work to something like this sounds very like he's talking about Marx and Engels, sort of bearded left Hegelians in the factories of England or something like that. And you're thinking, who else could that be but Marx and Engels? But I just think he would never, that's just not his world. Partly because his philosophy is deeply ahistorical. I
Mm,
mean, he doesn't believe that anything really changes,
mm,
um, and therefore politics or
right.
anything else can't change anything at a deep level. And that's one of the things that actually all the Marxists, whether it's the Frankfurt School or Lukács, whatever, were in agreement about, which is that they were bound to think that change was possible. and that they disagreed about how, and they disagreed about its sources, but they did think that those sources could be ameliorated or radically altered, and Schopenhauer just didn't think that. So I think he was never going to be eye to eye with someone like Marx in that respect. On the other hand, there are interesting passages of his work where he does talk about the proletariat.
Mm.
He doesn't talk about revolution, but he talks about luxury industries, and he talks about the way that there is luxury industries and the distribution of labor, the division of labor even, is just creating more misery than is necessary for human life.
Mm.
And that's an interesting, point. Again, not a point that people would necessarily associate with Schopenhauer. And in particular, he was deeply critical of, the use of enslaved people in those luxury industries. In particular, Black African enslavement of people in the US, and he was very critical of the US on those grounds, amongst others. He thought that the US was a failed state from the start because of its use of enslavement. However, there's always howevers and buts. When I'm discussing with these things with my students, they were kind of, they think, oh, that's interesting. Schopenhauer is aware of the way that luxury industries exploit work and so on and so forth. But he actually then defends the division of intellectual and physical labor, precisely because he thinks that, he does think ultimately that the division of physical and intellectual labor that luxury industries depend on and produce,
Mhm.
it enables something good for humankind in various ways, because it enables thinkers like him to not have to do physical labor and actually spend their time producing these brilliant works of philosophy that not only are good for readers. Like, of course, if it was just producing books that people could read and enjoy, that would be a little bit of a self-serving kind of defense of this division of labor. But he says at one point that societies need thinkers as well as workers. The reason being that he thinks that a kind of an enormous workforce that is not well guided. He's very Platonic in this sense. It's a bit like Plato's Republic. An enormous and powerful workforce that is not well guided is actually less efficient than a small one that is well guided,
Mm.
And so we need something like, as Plato will call it, philosopher kings and what have you.
Mhm.
So that's, the thing. He was in favor of the division of labor on which these, the production of luxury depends. Even though at the same time, he was obviously deeply concerned with the suffering that it caused, particularly the unfairness of the physical and the toll of the physical labor. So I don't know. Again, what a Marxist. I'm not a Marxist, so I don't know, or a Marxist scholar, but I don't know what they'd make of that. But they might see something in Schopenhauer that he, at least, even if he didn't sort of think revolution was the answer, they could all agree. They could all agree on their sympathies for the conditions of the working people.
Yeah. And based on what you wrote in the beginning or toward the beginning of the book, so you talked about like so this is actually what I really want to get into now because it's super interesting. Schopenhauer's temperament. So you essentially mentioned that there was so he was going to be an apprentice for, I don't remember now for whom, but it was some sort of
Yeah,
business. So you can
yeah,
tell us. But the point was to say that essentially his temperament was one of somebody who essentially was a writer, right? Who spent a lot of his
yeah,
time in deep thought, who probably more or less didn't want to kind of go through the daily sort of the trudgery of kind of daily trading, especially manual labor, etc. And so I remember you making the point or the case. You essentially said something along the lines of because we were talking about like why was Schopenhauer miserable, right? And I'm going to kind of mix in sort of themes here. So you mentioned the suicide and the death of his father. So and the question kind of came up of what was it that sort of caused Schopenhauer's pessimism? And so you made the point that he was essentially like this from childhood, and there was this sense of like sort of Schopenhauer kind of being frequently bored, right? There was a kind of like an inability to sort of live the sort of in the mundaneness of things, right? In the kind of ordinariness of it. And so interestingly, right, when we think about Schopenhauer saying something like this, like let's say division of labor should be between intellectuals and kind of more or less the manual workers. I mean, of course he's going to say that. That's incredibly self-serving. So for somebody like him, he needs there to be the sect of philosopher kings or these sort of planners, etc. Because for somebody like him, he didn't want to do the drudgery of the daily stuff. Meaning Schopenhauer wouldn't have done admin work. So, but my point is to say is that, interestingly enough, right, this sort of speaks to his character. And what I would wonder is how much of his philosophy do you think was kind of more of just like a preference for what worked for Schopenhauer? Meaning, I'm sure he had a lot of rationalizations for it, right? But how much of it do you think was just honestly based on his temperament alone, where you could say, yeah, of course Schopenhauer would think that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, there are certain points in his philosophy that it's really hard not to like read biographically, or to read in a way that sort of serves his own aims, or captures his own, preconceived values and beliefs and so on. The case of suicide is one of them. So, as you mentioned, his father died in what the family strongly suspected was a suicide when Schopenhauer was 17. They'd just returned from a grand tour of Europe, he and his parents. And in fact, he compares that tour and that time in his life to the story you told about the Buddha. He says that it was like his awakening because of all the pain. Because while they were on this grand tour of Europe, they also visited places like, prisons, and he saw people be hanged, and these sorts of horrible sights that people would, in the early 19th century treat as kind of tourist destinations. And the case for suicide, like again, I don't think it's the proper way to fully explain and evaluate his ideas. But the point, the view he reaches basically is that suicide, well, the simplistic way to put it is that there is a moral right to suicide, but a moral reason against it. That's the simplest way to put it. The moral right being basically that your life is your own. He was very anti-Kantian in this, in terms of like, he thought you could instrumentalize your own life by disposing of it if life is causing you too much suffering. And there should be no taboo, there should be no shame and stigma about that. And again, that would be consistent with somebody who has personal experience of suicide from a person who he at least venerated. Schopenhauer's father was quite a strict and hard guy, quite tough on Schopenhauer, but Schopenhauer still respected him, venerated him, and was grateful to what the life that his father made possible, even in his death. So he wanted to pay that sort of do something for his father in that respect, I think, by humanizing his suicide and destigmatizing his suicide. The moral reason against suicide, though, so that this all gets very Schopenhauerian at this point, which is that he actually thinks that suicide is almost kind of a wasted opportunity, because the very same suffering that drives somebody to suicide, on the assumption that that's the kind of suicide we're talking about, the kind that's done out of suffering rather than some sort of philosophical enlightenment, that same suffering can sometimes be the impetus for this moral transformation we were talking about earlier. And so you kind of, his analogy is that it's like somebody who refuses to complete an operation and would rather stay ill, he says, And okay, so how does that fit into, if we're going to kind of read his father's suicide in that light? Well, he thinks that it was the wrong choice, maybe. He thinks that his father shouldn't have committed suicide from a kind of higher perspective. I'm not sure if we ever thought his father was going to achieve enlightenment or something. I doubt it. But it's interesting that he's very firmly not encouraging of suicide. He says suicide is not a solution. He disagrees with the Stoic perspective on suicide. So we have a man who wants to destigmatize suicide, but also discourage it. To me, again, not to over psychoanalyze this, but that is consistent with a person of personal experience of suicide. So I do, but that's not, again, grounds to evaluate. Doesn't make him right or wrong. And actually, we could just tell the whole story of his philosophy of suicide without the personal story, and it would make fine sense, So we don't need all these things. But it is an instance of the thing you were asking about, which is that sometimes Schopenhauer's ideas are kind of useful ways of reading the story of his life, and sometimes they seem to, maybe there is a personal interest in there among them, and maybe he is capturing, things that have come out of his life. There are other examples too. We could take his mother's, interestingly, there is something, again, I write about in the book. He has this, this is going to get into different territory.
Yes.
He has this essay called On Women. which is deeply sexist, deeply misogynistic. But the one of its few redeeming features is that he thinks it's wrong that women's equality at the time was conditional on marriage, pretty much, or the potential for it. Women who were not marriageable were in a very disadvantaged social position.
Mm.
And he says they kind of languish as spinsters, he says, or they may become sex workers. Like he thought that he called sex workers, he said they were human sacrifices on the altar of monogamy. He thought they were kind of there to keep up the pretense of monogamy in the kind of marriage institution. And so a lot of his sympathy in that essay is for unmarried women. Now, this is a man whose mother is a widow and whose sister is a confirmed, it's not a nice word, but spinster, just as he is a confirmed bachelor. And again, you can read, if you wanted to, you can read something into that. And you can read even further into it, which is that he's very kind of sympathetic to spinsters and in the way that he was much closer to his sister than his mother.
Mm.
With widows, he seems to think that even though they are, in a difficult position when you lose your husband in early 19th century Europe or mid 19th century Europe, or any point in the 19th century, really, you're in trouble.
Mm.
And you'd think that would make him entirely sympathetic to those women, but actually he sort of seems to think that they owe their husbands something. They owe their husbands honor, and they owe their husbands not to squander whatever fortune's been left to them, whatever. And again, very hard not to read Schopenhauer's difficult relationship with his own mother into that.
Mm.
Again, don't have to.
Mhm.
Could just leave the philosophy as it is. But, for me, it makes the ideas somehow more exciting and to give them, make them more tangible to see how they fit in with the life.
Mm.
Something just to pivot a little bit. So artists and writers gravitated towards Schopenhauer, like for
Mhm.
example, Tolstoy, Beckett, Proust, right? What do you think was the appeal to artists about Schopenhauer versus philosophers? Like, what did they get out of him? Yeah.
I mean, I think it's multiple things. Where to start? One is that he was just such a good writer himself
Right.
in several respects. Like he was entertaining to read. He could be lyrical. He could be funny, dry, sarcastic. He can tell stories. He's got a good eye for symbolism in nature, for turns of phrase. He's himself extremely literate and artistically learned. He knows all about painting. He knows all about music, which he adored. Um, and he brings that to his philosophy and uses literary examples from ancient and from modern, from East and from West, everywhere. So he's just a joy to read, and importantly, not just for philosophers. He's not overly technical, like he does use some of, particularly of Kantian kind of language, and he can, get very analytical at times, but he's not exclusively writing in that mode and not excessively writing in that mode.
Mm.
So he was not only entertaining but accessible.
Mm.
And then of course also he's the issues he's talking about are not abstract ones, but actually it's not far before they connect with some deep, very human problem, the kind of problem of suffering. Even metaphysics itself, he thought was rooted in a kind of, painful,
Mm.
kind of confusion of being born into this world that is so full of suffering and ends in death. Like he thinks that's one of the sources of metaphysical speculation as well as consolation for death itself. And then finally, I suppose that the other reason is that aside from these transcendent moral experiences that we started talking about earlier, art and aesthetics and natural beauty as well as human created beauty for him are kind of a step on that pathway, that they are a form of selflessness that's available to us when we become absorbed in an aesthetic experience. And so he had a huge amount of respect for art, and art respected him back. I think that's one way to look at it. And so particularly writers were attracted to him, but musicians as well, famously Richard Wagner, um, but other artists too. I think they recognized, they kind of saw something of themselves in him. So if you were to kind of enumerate them, I'm sure there's more artists who've been influenced by Schopenhauer than philosophers.
Mm. And so going back to the clinical aspect of all of this, so before we started filming, so
Mm.
so we were talking about the Schopenhauer cure. So this
Yeah,
was
you were telling me about that.
yeah. So this was a book that I read about probably a little bit more than a decade ago at this point. So Yalom wrote it, God knows what. I think
Mhm.
it was originally published, if I had to guess, like I think 2006, maybe 2007. So in the Schopenhauer cure, so I'm not going to get into the whole story, but like the point is to say half of the story is about a therapy group, and then the other half of the story is actually his biography, which is really cool because obviously, now we're also talking about his biography.
Ah.
But the interesting part about it was that the person who I guess you would somewhat of the protagonist. I don't know, maybe because there were several protagonists, but let's say to me at least he stood out the most. So it was a character named Paul. And so the way sort of Yalom framed it was that Paul essentially, so he was kind of in and out of therapy. He was a sex addict in the book. He had sort of difficulties connecting to people. He honestly was autistic. Most of the time where he was in the therapy group and he would talk to everybody, he kind of just stared up at the ceiling while speaking. Pretty autistic thing to do, right? But the point was to say that so therapy hadn't worked for him. This is sort of how the story progresses. So he finds himself in this therapy group and he's like, therapy doesn't really work for me. A lot of the ideas never made sense, whatever, etc. Right. And then so somewhere down the line, he discovers Schopenhauer. And so apparently, according to Paul, he said, Schopenhauer saved me. Right. So he's like, where sort of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, especially was sort of no use for me, Schopenhauer's ideas were. And then in the book, he becomes a philosophical counselor. And most of his meaning is actually found through Schopenhauer. And so even though he's a philosophical counselor, kind of more broadly, right, he actually is more so along the lines of a disciple of Schopenhauer, where he uses his ideas in a kind of psychotherapeutic way to maybe not necessarily remedy, but to kind of aid, right? And again, not to heal, but to sort of help. So with that being said, right, so the way that Yalom presented it himself as an existential therapist, essentially, the book is called The Schopenhauer Cure, right? So the
Mhm.
way that he presented it was that Schopenhauer's ideas are kind of a remedy. And there's this sort of famous saying in the book. I don't think that this is from Schopenhauer. Actually, it might have been from Schopenhauer. You would know, David. So he had this saying in the book where he says something along the lines of, shit, I wish I remembered now. Was it Schopenhauer or not? But it was in the book. So he says in the book, he says, although the physicality of death destroys us, the idea of death can save us. And so that was sort of that was a kind of core theme throughout the book, right? Sort of focusing on kind of like your death as a way to find meaning in life, but also again going into the specifics of Schopenhauer's ideas. Again, going back to Paul. I'm sorry, his name wasn't Paul. His name was Philip. I'm so sorry. So the guy's name was Philip. Yeah. So
Philip,
Philip,
that's my
yeah.
dad. That was my dad's name.
Nice. Yeah. It wasn't Paul. Fuck. Okay, so the point is to say that Philip essentially his idea was that like all we really need is Schopenhauer at the end of the day. Like so his whole thing was like intellectually it's all kind of bullshit outside of Schopenhauer. So David, then my question to you, if there's
Mm.
any sort of psychotherapeutic clinical ideas that you found in Schopenhauer
Yeah.
that maybe not necessarily a cure or a remedy, but at least somewhat of a balm for people and kind of
Yeah.
humanity in general, what could they
So,
be?
well, here's one that's not in the book
Mhm.
because I couldn't really find a way to fit it in. But so Schopenhauer has this theory of happiness,
Hmm.
and at first it sounds like it's going to get us nowhere, which is it's a negative theory of happiness. He thinks that happiness is just the absence of suffering,
Hmm.
and even intense experience of happiness, like phenomenologically positive, like big rushes, I kind of still have a metaphysically negative nature. So like a kind of pause in like loud music can have a kind of profound impact, even though technically it's negative, you know?
Sure.
And so when you're kind of ecstatic with joy, what you really are is kind of having intense relief from pain, is what he thinks. Now, okay, we could quibble about the details. How is that really plausible to account for all sorts of happiness? But look, from a psychological perspective, sometimes it has a lot of insight. Like, for instance, when he actually uses analogies to express his idea, one of my favorites is he says that we don't feel the health of the whole body, but the small spot where the shoe pinches. We tend to focus on the tiny little pains, forgetting that the negation of those pains, namely, like if you are lucky enough to be, fully able-bodied and without chronic pain, things like that, you don't even notice it. And I think that's psychologically astute. It's true of most people. And then now this is where I kind of slightly diverge from Schopenhauer, or at least, apply his theory in a way that I'm not sure he intends it.
Mm.
But certainly, well, the link here is that he thinks that when we do have feelings of happiness, often they are only possible on the condition of a kind of period of reflection where we maybe have the thing that we were after, and we kind of remember or reflect on the time that we didn't. And we, through this reflection, we feel the benefit of the thing that we have.
Hmm.
It's like, oh, wasn't it shit when we didn't have central heating, but now we're so warm,
Hmm.
and of course we don't appreciate day in, day out, but I remember those cold days, and it's so good to have this now. It's second nature now. We barely even notice it, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
Um, and I actually think that's quite a helpful thing to remind yourself of sometimes.
Hmm.
Again, it's a bit of a luxury item if you've got the presence of mind and you've got the material things that are actually, that you can reflect on. But to go back to that analogy, like if the stone in your shoe is the biggest worry in your life's going pretty well, right? That's,
Hmm.
so so I do try and cultivate that even in very difficult times. To get quite personal about this, the book is dedicated to my dad, who died of cancer during like the writing before I'd written the last few chapters. Obviously, that was quite
Condolences.
interesting writing about a man whose life was shaped by the death of his father, albeit at a much younger age, but still. Um, and I obviously miss my dad, and I can't, enjoy him now in the way that I can only enjoy, you know, the effects he's had on me, the things that kind of last.
Hmm.
But I'm very lucky that I had a really wonderful dad, and not everyone does, and I had a really good relationship, and I think that's why I could happily dedicate my whole book to him and say with sincerity that he was, the best of all possible dads.
Mm.
And yeah, not everyone has that, and I don't want to take that for granted. And so I do, that's one example of where I'm thinking, okay, if I reflect on it and I remember the good times I had with my dad and how awful it would have been not to have had. I mean, I'm sorry, this is the other side of this, is that this might be quite hard for other people to hear if they didn't have a good dad, or didn't have a dad at all. Obviously, um, my gratitude is going to make them feel potentially awful,
Hmm.
unless that's the thing. They can search for the thing in their life. They go, yeah, but I had this, whatever that thing might be, that
Hmm.
maybe other people don't, that you can't take for granted, that maybe other people don't have. Again, I couldn't fit that into the book very seamlessly because it would require me, because one of the conceits of the book is to kind of use an example of from Schopenhauer's life, so the book, obviously talking about the ethics of suicide, we can talk about suicide of his own father, but to illustrate the theory of happiness, I'd have to find some happy events in Schopenhauer's life, and there aren't that many happy events in Schopenhauer's life, so I couldn't find an example of where he was actually practicing this, because I may be applying it in a way that he didn't really intend. But yeah, that's one, I think, therapeutic application of one of his theories that it certainly helps me, you know, genuinely feel happier sometimes. Yeah.
Gotcha.
While we were speaking about that, I was trying to locate an Alan Watts quote,
Hmm.
which
Okay.
I've not found it apparently, but that's fine. It was something along the lines of the amount of variables that you can take into consideration in a given moment
Uh,
are nearly infinite.
Hmm.
And
yeah.
so if your mind goes to, the stone in my shoe or
Mm,
whatever it is, but you actually are able to, with, for example, gratitude, kind of zoom out, think about all these other things that you can pay attention to. It will take away that significance of, the stone in your eye, or I forget what
yeah,
the
yeah,
actual
yeah.
Hmm.
saying is,
Hmm.
but yeah.
Hmm.
No,
Yeah, there's always something. Well, I don't know. When I say there's always something, of course, there are some people who have nothing to hold on to. Like their life, at least right now, is ultimately absolutely shit. And the thing is, again, there's plenty of, Schopenhauer will appeal to them too, because, he's articulating that side of life as well. Even this theory of happiness is very much set against the normality of suffering, So,
Hmm.
um, but you're right. There's so much, there's so much to look. A life is made out of so many things that usually you can focus your mind on something.
Hmm.
I even find it can be quite a good, way of gaining perspective on, and moving, one's attention away from something that's quite troubling. If I'm, quite, stressful situation, anxiety provoking um,
Yep.
situation, that, certain things, those are the things my mind I'll try and turn to that help me calm down or whatever. So I get what you're saying there. There's when there's just so many facets to any life, that there should hopefully be something that everybody can hold on to and go, well, I'm glad I have that.
Mm.
Because lots of people don't.
Yeah,
And
and
maybe I didn't used to, and now I do, or whatever.
yeah, and I think Schopenhauer's relationship with just suffering in general, or pain even more broadly, is kind of interesting. Just because, like, I personally like can't really make sense of it. So you mentioned you kind of compared the sort of the idea or the thought experiment of the eternal recurrence. Another
Mm,
thing Yalom talks about.
yeah.
So and the Nietzsche version sort of differs from the Schopenhauer one, right? So where the Schopenhauer one sort of cancels pain is sort of and suffering is canceled out by pleasure, and the idea is like, well, there's some things to live for, right? With Nietzsche, it's not really like that. I think the idea with Nietzsche is more along the lines of you sort of make meaning of the suffering, right? You kind of lean into it and it's the thing, right? Whereas for Schopenhauer, it's like, we kind of want to try to escape from it and, hope for the best in other cases, right? So I guess I would ask, like, sort of more broadly. So then what does suffering then mean to Schopenhauer, just at the fundamental level? How does he understand it or its meaning?
Yeah. So so I mean, the source of suffering, the origin of suffering for Schopenhauer is, at least from the point of view of an individual human being, it has an internal source. Um, that picture gets complicated when you realize that the individual will, is itself a manifestation of a wider phenomenon. But from kind of ordinary human perspective, suffering has an internal source, namely our, in a very Buddhistic way, our desires, the cycle of desire, and our, this is something that also Nietzsche disagreed with, which is that for Schopenhauer, our experience of wanting something and not having it and chasing after it is an exclusively painful one, because pain implies lack. Desire implies lack, and a painfully felt lack, painful enough to motivate us to seek the object of the desire. Nietzsche disagreed. Nietzsche thought that our experience of willing can be
Mhm.
pleasurable and powerful as well as painful, and maybe all of those things at once and what have you. But Schopenhauer thinks that's the origin of suffering. And then in terms of its meaning in another sense, I mean, we've already touched on this slightly, but he seems to think that suffering can have, for want of a better word, instrumental value.
Mm.
Um, so again, Nietzsche disagrees with him slightly on this, in that Nietzsche seems to think that there's a way of valuing something that's not purely instrumental, that suffering itself can somehow be transformed into something valuable.
Mm.
Um, but for Schopenhauer, there is instrumental value to it. For instance, the kind of suffering. Sorry if you can hear banging in the
That's
background
okay.
of my
Oh
building.
no, everything's good.
Um, the kind of suffering that you undergo that kind of explodes the ego or whatever, as a pathway to salvation, is
Mm.
instrumentally good, and maybe even be worth seeking, or worth potentially being born for. That's an interesting, possible question there, as to whether the suffering that we have in life is, if it gives us a possibility of salvation from life, is actually, makes life worth living, rather than never having been born at all. That's one
Mm.
possible interpretation of Schopenhauer's philosophy that would move him away from, the kind of, strictly antinatalist view that it'd be better never to have been born. My former PhD supervisor, Chris Jenner, has been writing about this recently in a quite interesting way. Yeah.
Wow, I love that. Okay, and so before we wrap up, sort of
Yeah.
one final question before our final question. So, what do you feel like makes Schopenhauer's philosophy timeless?
Timeless. Okay, good. Well, it's kind of, timelessness is kind of baked into it, because he's talking about, um, the suffering that characterizes a human life, as well as non-human sentient life. So even though he is known as this philosopher who gave this, put pessimism on a philosophical footing, and that's why, it's kind of, kind of well, this was a historical fact, which is the word pessimism was kind of invented in Schopenhauer's lifetime, virtually, adopted. So it's only in his later work that he actually starts using the term anyway. So he was the first to be able to put it on a footing, philosophical footing, under that banner of pessimism. But when he does that, he often, like, there's a page of the second volume of The World as One Representation that just goes on for, a few pages where he's just quoting basically everything from Sophocles to Shakespeare, articulating similarly pessimistic views. And yeah, so it is something that human beings have been trying to express about their condition from, the greatest ancient playwrights to the greatest modern playwrights. So there's that. The other thing, though, is to go full circle back to where we started. The kind of aside from a kind of higher, more rarer form of salvation, the way that we human beings address that is through compassion. The only way really we have to live through, I'll say, rather than with that state of affairs is by helping, being motivated by that suffering to help one another. And I think that's fairly timeless too, and a bit more of a lighter shade than the kind of, we all thrown into this similar condition together, but also we have each other to try and bear it. I think that's pretty timeless too.
I love that so much. All right, Alan, final questions for David before we wrap up.
Oh, yes, please. If we wanted to follow your
Okay.
work, and of course buy the book, where maybe we do that. Yeah.
Okay, good. So in terms of following me, I'm on Instagram. My handle is all academic, all_academic. But then I'm also on Blue Sky, and that's David Obey the Woods, just my full name. I still have an X account, partly for promotional purposes. I get drawn back into it. And that's D Bay the Woods. So I'm on, a few different social media platforms. And then in terms of buying the book, you can buy it straight off the University of Chicago Press website. Or you can buy it, from your local bookseller, what have you. Maybe use bookshop.org. I think that's maybe a more ethical online retailer, or order it in or something like that. I think Chicago are pretty actually good at kind of making sure bookshops are supplied and stuff. And it's available, in the US, in the UK. I've spotted people on German Instagram posting about it, so that suggests it's made its way there. There's a Dutch translation that's appeared, and hopefully there'll be others too. So yeah, it should be easy to come by. Yeah.
Yep. And I've already started reading it, and I love it.
Yeah. Thank you.
David, thank you so much for coming on. This was excellent, man. So fascinating.
This is awesome. Yeah.
That was a pleasure. It was really good. Really, really good questions. Lots of things I hadn't anticipated talking about. So that's a good sign.
I love it, man. And I love that you took it in stride. All right, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
All right. Have a good night, man. Bye.
Thanks.
All right. So everyone, of course, if you want to follow the show, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On X, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.